Adab. It is my singular pleasure and privilege to welcome you to Habib University's 4th Post-Colonial Higher Education Conference. I am Noman Naqvi, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Humanities at Habib. The Post-Colonial Higher Education Conference is Habib University's flagship conference, launched on the cusp of our inauguration. In its last iteration, the theme of our conference was the inheritance of injustice. This year, our theme is reparative futures, decolonial thought in the global ruins. As the chair of this conference, allow me to thank all the very distinguished panelists for participating in our conference, as well as my colleagues, both in the faculty and staff who have worked and are working to make this happen. Since this is the inaugural panel, allow me to briefly iterate the rationale behind the conference. We live in a profoundly damaged world. The great acceleration of the Anthropocene has laid bare the extraordinary destruction and radical ruinations that the world has experienced in the modern period. The monumental losses and ruinations of this age go well beyond the biosphere, that is the very ground of all life on our planet. They now manifestly encompass the ruination of polities, economies, societies, ethics, religions, and traditions. The unprecedented modern processes of acceleration and ruination that have brought us to this conjuncture include not just global capitalism, but concurrently the racist phenomena of colonialism and nationalism. Together, they have inaugurated a global form of life in which universal competition and enmity is the real motor of progress, as well as both social and ecological destruction. The stakes could not possibly be higher. The current pandemic has only brought into even greater relief the tremendous injustice and suffering that are endemic to our global form of life everywhere, even as there is now nowhere to hide from the Anthropocene, as ecological catastrophe becomes a feature of the quotidian global news cycle. Reparations are in order. The phrase reparative futures in our title includes both the therapeutic or healing sense of repairing, as well as the ethical and juridical sense of making amends and compensation. The 4th Post-Colonial Higher Education Conference will be a reflection on truth and reparations today, to speak the truth of our condition and its causes, and to reflect on how our anomic world may be repaired for a future of possibilities rather than dead ends. I'll now turn to the chair of this first panel on repairing the biosphere to my distinguished colleague, Professor Shah Jamal, who is an associate professor in the Dhanani School of Science and Engineering, but whose erudition and expansive interests he also teaches as a result of that in the School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. So please introduce Professor Shah Jamal, and please introduce our very distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Noman Naqvi, and thank you for a generous introduction. So we begin with the panel, Repairing Biosphere. And just to give a context, the biosphere is a global ecosystem as defined by Britannica or other places. It is a system composed of living organisms and the non-living organisms, things, and how there's a flow of energy and nutrients that actually goes between all of these living organisms that we share together. But more importantly, the global emergence of colonial and racial capitalism in the modern period, historically, followed by the formation of this apartheid system of cooperative non-nation state, has severely damaged the Earth's biosphere. So the great acceleration that we have observed in the mid-1940s and the mid-20th century, we saw an exponential growth rate across a wide range of human activities. The acceleration of progress, as Dr. Naqvi was just saying, had made human species a force of nature and have significantly damaged the Earth's biosphere, the climate and its ecosystem. So I quote from The Shock of Anthropocene. It's co-authored by one of our panelists today. And I quote that the conclusion that forces itself upon us, disturbing as it may be, is that our ancestors destroyed environments in full awareness of what they were doing, quote, unquote. So our panelists today will analyze the key causes and features of this accelerating ruination. And hopefully we will be seeing some visions of healing this rift between the Earth and modern humanity. And with that, may I now introduce our two panelists in alphabetic order. So our first panelist is Professor Jean-Baptiste Fressoz, who is an historian of science, technology, and environment, and he's based on the French National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. Is joining us from there. He is a author of several books, including The Shock of the Anthropocene, The Earth, History, and Us, that he co-authored with Christophe Bonnel. It is one of the books that are in our post pack for the Habib Liberal Core of What is Modernity that Naman and I have the honor to teach as well, along with several of our colleagues. The two chapters from this book are the essential readings of our What is Modernity course over here. He's also the author of a recently published The Rewards of the Sky, a 15th to 20th century history of climate change. And we'll be looking forward to hearing what he has to say about repairing the biosphere. My second panelist, speaker is Professor George Weiblen, who is a science director of the Bell Museum in the University of Minnesota. He is a distinguished McKnight University professor with an undergrad degree from Reed College and a master's and PhD from Harvard. He is a tenured professor in the Department of Plant and Microbiology and the College of Biological Sciences. I've had the honor to watch a few times his wonderful commencement speech that he gave 2 years ago, and hopefully we'll be hearing some more about it during the talk. Professor Weiblen has studied for more than 25 years about cultural and biological diversity in Papua New Guinea. He and his team are part of the Forest Global Earth Observation Network. It's one of the largest global networks that are dedicated to advancing long-term study of the world forest. Professor Weiblen, also a resident fellow of the Institute on Environment, an interdisciplinary institute that seeks solutions to Earth's most pressing environment problems through innovative research, partnerships, and leadership development. So without further ado, may I humbly invite our first speaker, Professor Jean-Baptiste Fressoz, to share his thought with us. Over to you.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Noman, Shah, for inviting me to give a presentation in your conference. I'm really honored and a bit intimidated. I would like to start with this painting. If it works well, you should have a painting of an aqueduct dating from the mid-19th century painter Huguet. It is an interesting painting because it shows a very important presence of the ruins in the colonial discourse, not only in French colonial discourse, but in British colonial discourse. The idea that the colonization was a restoration of nature was very, very central to the justification of colonization and invasion. In 1830, as perhaps you know, France invaded Algeria. And for French settlers and colonists and theoreticians of empire, it was important to describe Algeria as a ruined country, a country that had been ruined, that had been destroyed, environmentally destroyed, deforested, degraded, a land which had been degraded by centuries of conquests. It was, of course, a racist discourse, a discourse which was directed against Islam. And it is interesting to see how much this discourse was embedded in controversies around deforestation and around environmental degradation. In 1830, it had been almost half a century since the idea of anthropogenic climate change linked to deforestation was really discussed and debated in the French public sphere. Since the French Revolution, the idea that we had to repair nature, that France and most and Europe had to be repaired, was put forward, explaining that for centuries, people had degraded the land, and especially peasants. So the idea and the discourse on climate change at that time was really centered on the forest and the problem of deforestation. And the main argument was that by cutting down forests, people were altering the climate, were changing the cycle of water. It was well known since early 18th century that the trees had an important role in the water cycle. And the idea was that each tree, each plant, each leaves actually was a small kind of generator of vapor, of humidity. And because of this theory, since the late 18th century, there was a discourse explaining that we were actually destroying the nature and the climate. And colonization in this context was thought as a way to repair environment which had been destroyed previously. It was thought as a climatic restoration. In the early 19th century in France, the French state, the French government ordered a national inquiry on climate change and deforestation. And it's 1820. It's a national inquiry which is set up in 1820. And at the time, the government, the conservative government, was blaming the French Revolution. The idea of repairing nature was clearly put forward by foresters. And this forester, for instance, who is called Roche, actually published a whole journal on climate change and deforestation starting from 1822. And he was describing the south of France or part of France as already degraded. And he had a whole program of regenerating nature, for instance, by planting trees. So repairing nature has a very long story. It is clearly embedded historically in narratives of colonial destruction and of colonial justification, sorry. And the narrative is clearly Orientalist in the sense of Edward Said. I mean, there is a very strong presence of the East and in this discourse. And for instance, the ruins of Babylon were invoked by such foresters as François-Antoine Roche in order to explain that this glorious civilization of antiquity had disappeared, had collapsed because of deforestation and climate change. In a way, they had created their own collapse by poorly managing their environment. This discourse on environment was deeply connected with political problems and issues of the time. I mean, forests in the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, forests are absolutely crucial in the economies of every country. I mean, the wood was like the cement and the petroleum of that time. It was both energy and construction materials. And the important point is that at that time already, climate was envisaged on a global scale. This is a striking representation of the Earth system in late 17th century England. And climate was thought on a global scale because of natural theology. At that time, the dominant paradigm in natural sciences was that, of course, the world is a creation, a perfect creation by an infinitely superior being, God. And the Earth was created as a perfect machinery, a perfect system. And one way to prove the existence of God was to show the complexity and the beauty and the connection at the global scale of everything on Earth. And one way to do that was to study the global cycle of water, which is represented on this engraving by Thomas Burnett. Here you have a beautiful representation of the global water cycle. The water in the oceans, in the tropical zone, evaporates thanks to the heat, and then circulates in the atmosphere before reaching the northern latitudes where fortunately Britain lies. So there is this idea that the whole Earth is a connected system which is organized for the greater good, especially of the British people. And in this theory, for instance, the mountains have a crucial place because they are the point where all these vapors circulating in the atmosphere will condense, and then they erode the slope of the mountains, which create fertilizing elements in the plains. So, I mean, my point here is to show you that we did not enter the Anthropocene in a kind of blind modernity. There are a lot of knowledge, a lot of debates, a lot of preoccupations, a lot of worries on environmental issues, starting from the late 18th century at least. Climate was an important aspect, but it is not, of course, the only aspect. There were plenty of debates on what was called at the time the economy of nature. The fact that nature is organized through an infinitely complex network and waves of interrelationships. Nature is an economy. It is organized because every natural beings are interconnected with one another. So this is a very, very powerful paradigm, which is put forward, for instance, by Linnaeus himself, who writes a book in 1750 called Nature's Economy. And it is powerful in all. I mean, you can find the influence of this of this vision in many texts of the second part of the 18th century. So the notion of ecosystem, if you wish, has very old pedigree and heritage. I think the point of explaining that we did not, we entered the Anthropocene knowingly, in a way, is to repoliticize the narrative of the Anthropocene. When you read the main text on the Anthropocene published since the year 2000, you've got a ground narrative which is too simple. Basically, for 2 centuries, we destroyed nature. We shifted, the Earth shifted to another geological epoch. But basically, humanity was doing that in a kind of blind way. But nowadays, thanks to Earth science and modern environmental science, we can enter in a good Anthropocene, in an Anthropocene which is enlightened by knowledge and by science. And that's why the Anthropocene has always been connected with discourses on geoengineering. And these discourses, you have different kinds of discourses on geoengineering. It goes from the most radical one, like managing the solar radiation on a global scale, to more, how can I say, more moderate discourses. And of course, among these discourses, you've got the idea of planting trees, for instance, which has come full force for a few years, and which is rehearsing old ideas about the environmental and climatic values of trees. And when you see the Prime Minister of Australia, who, of course, Australia is one of the villain in the climate change story right now, because it's probably the biggest coal exporter of the world. When you see the Prime Minister of Australia explaining that, well, never mind, we'll plant 1 billion trees in the next years, and right afterwards you've got, of course, the huge fires in Australia. You see this discrepancy between, on the one hand, a discourse about repairing nature and repairing the climate, which is a kind of hubristic discourse. The fact that we have a mastery on such a thing as the carbon cycle. Okay, this is an impressive discourse of mastery. We are emitting carbon. With trees, we are going to capture carbon. And there is discourse of reversibility behind this idea of repairing nature. And on the other hand, you got a perfect example of the loss of mastery on this phenomenon of climate change, and the spiraling, of course, phenomenon of climate change, fires, increasing the CO2 in the atmosphere, increasing the effect of climate change. So I think on this notion of repairing nature, on colonialism, you got a long history of discourses which it's important to have in mind in order to better understand the discourses around the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene, I mean, I'm going to give you just a few elements of what's in the book that I wrote with Christophe Bonneuil. I mean, we wrote this book now some time ago, almost 10 years ago, when the Anthropocene was started to become really very visible in the public sphere and in the scientific literature. I was really impressed by the fact that the discourse, I mean, I'm criticizing, but of course, the Anthropocene has interesting aspects. I mean, for instance, it shows the temporal dimension of what we are doing. We are not living a mere environmental crisis, which is like a short period of, it seems to be a short period of time. It seems to be like just a bad moment and to cross, and just like the epidemics nowadays, I mean, it's going to be over sooner or later. But in fact, with the word Anthropocene, we have a completely different temporal dimension given to the environmental crisis. It's not a mere crisis. It is a geological revolution. It's a new geological epoch. And we have been shifting the dynamics of the Earth system for centuries and millennia. Okay, so that's really an important concept. On the other hand, it rehearses a lot of discourses which were extremely problematic, and I think one of the main aspects is, of course, it rehearses a neo-Malthusian discourse of the anthropos, of the human species, responsible as a species, as a biological species, which is, of course, the core element behind a neo-Malthusian discourse since Malthus himself, and which was very important in the US and British reflection on environment in the 19th and 20th centuries. But when you look a bit more in detail about the history of the Anthropocene, you got a different narrative which can be put forward. For instance, when you look at CO2 emissions, for a long period of time, the biggest emitter of CO2 were by far Britain and the US. For, I mean, let's say before 1970, most of the CO2 emissions, cumulative CO2 emissions, came from just two countries. Even rich industrial countries such as Germany or even the USSR, where historically they've emitted much less emission than the US and Britain. If you look at cumulative emission, you have to wait for the late 1970s to see the emission of the rest of the world overpassing the emissions of Britain and the US. So for quite a long period of time, the Anglocene would have been a better word than the Anthropocene. Actually, of course, all this is completely now outdated because of the emergence of China, India, and other major contributors to CO2 emission. But there is really something historically which is very important, is to see that the dynamic of the Anthropocene comes from very limited geographies, very limited space, and it is closely connected to issues, of course, of industrial revolution, but also imperialism and colonialism. And another way to put that forward is to look at the flows of materials across the world. If you look at the trade balance, not in dollars, but in tons of materials, you have the interesting result that, I mean, most of the countries are exporting materials historically. And there are just a few countries which are importing materials, and it is the Western capitalist countries during the Great Acceleration. And of course, this dynamic changes around 2000 with the emergence of China as the major economic player. But I mean, this is a graphic representation of what environmental unequal exchange means. I mean, the fact that rich countries are exporting high value-added goods, which embodies little materials compared to poor countries. And this unequal global exchange is absolutely crucial to understand the dynamic of the Great Acceleration. If you take France, for instance, France, half of the materials which it consumes every year comes from foreign countries. It is mainly oil and gas, which of course weighs a lot in the physical trade balance, but it means that France depends enormously on foreign countries to live a high standard life. So the anthropos of the Anthropocene, we have to give names, we have to give a proper story and get rid of this very broad notion of the Anthropocene. And that's why there is a proliferation of new words to talk about this new geological epoch. And Capitalocene, of course, has been one of the most successful ones, but Anglocene and plenty of other words have been proposed by social scientists. It's not a very interesting debate, but it is important politically, at least, to really explain that there are very strong inequalities in the dynamic, in the global dynamic of climate change. My third argument is that as an historian, it's quite easy to demonstrate that the Anthropocene was not inexorable. I mean, there were other possible trajectories for humanity than entering a new geological epoch. When you look at history of tech, one of the striking elements coming from recent work is the fact that fossil fuels were marginal till quite late in the history of the rich world. If you take the US, for instance, in as late as 1880, most of the energy was still coming from renewables. Wind energy, for instance, which might seem completely new, as in a very old history in the US in particular. If you take the Middle West, in 1880, 1890, there were 6 million wind turbines powering the Middle West. It had all these wind turbines had a very huge role because it helped to pump water and so to irrigate large tract of land. And of course, the rise of the Middle West on the global commodity market is a major historical turn for the history of grain and the history of nutrition for the whole world. But if you take water energy, hydraulic energy, it is also dominant in the industry until 1870, 1880 in the US. Wood, of course, is very important, and even for iron, for casting iron, for siderurgy, for steel, to produce steel, wood was dominant till the late 19th century, and it is only between the two wars that wood really was replaced by coal massively for producing steel, and steel is of course one of the sector where coal was the most important. So what we call the Industrial Revolution, it is not based on coal, it is based on renewables, and it is really something that historians are advancing now as an important shift in the historiography. Another aspect is major technologies, major technological systems, which seems to us absolutely, inexorable and crucial for economic development. When you look at the early history of those systems, you could see that they were not that wanted. They were not desirable. If you take the example of cars, automobiles, of course, the automobile is probably one of the technology which is really at the center of the Anthropocene. When you talk about automobile, you are talking about roads, you are talking about cement production, the production of cement. You are talking really about a major piece in the history of the Anthropocene. In the US, the automobile was actually criticized very vehemently by many sectors of the population. I mean, at the beginning, in the early 1920s, the automobile is a luxury for rich people, and it's a pure nuisance for the rest of the population. Moreover, the automobile was competing with tramways, with electrical tramways. And in the 1820s in the US, there were hundreds of tramway companies in hundreds of different cities. The history of the destruction of the tramway is quite interesting. In 1935, an antitrust law was passed to force General Electric's, Insul, the big utilities, to sell their tramway companies for anti-monopoly reasons. The result was that suddenly hundreds of small tramway companies were on the market, and they were bought by Firestone, Standard Oil, and General Motors. And of course, for those companies, which are, I mean, their core business was to produce automobiles, to produce tires, and to extract oil, they would not want to invest in collective transportation, electrical collective transportation. So they would just close down the tramway lines, and they create, as such, a huge market for their own products. So that's one example among many others, which show you that you could imagine actually economic development, different kind of economic development, of course, without the massification of the individual car. Another example is Switzerland. Switzerland in the 1920s passed a law, the east part of Switzerland passed a law which forbids the individual cars. Trucks are allowed because they are useful, but cars are not allowed. And in Switzerland, it is possible to create a votation, what they call a votation, a referendum on specific topics. And the lobby for cars try to 10 times, they try to pass a referendum in order to break this interdiction of cars. And 10 times, the inhabitants of the eastern part of Switzerland say, no, we want to keep individual cars forbidden because they create more problems than they solve. And one last argument which is put forward in the book is the importance of war and the military in order to understand the dynamic of the Anthropocene. When you think about wars and when you think about the history of tech, you see that many of the technologies which are responsible for the environmental crisis and for the Anthropocene, they come from the military. If you take, for instance, pesticides, of course, the first pesticides came from the trench warfare and from the French and German innovation on chemical warfare, and then the US innovation on chemical warfare, which were fortunately forbidden in the Geneva Conference in the 1920s, but all this knowledge and all these production capacities were recycled in the agriculture business. And the same molecules, the same engineers who had devised the first gas for war actually repackaged these molecules and these innovations as pesticides for crops and agriculture. But when you look at the history of tech, you see that war is everywhere, even in the highways. It is well known that Nazi Germany was one of the first to invest in a national highway system. It was mainly for military reasons, so as to be able to shift troops from the east to the west very quickly. And in 1955, President Eisenhower in the US thought that it would be a good idea to do the same in the US, and they invested huge amounts of money in a national interstate highway system. And the aim was to deconcentrate, to spread industry on a national scale and at the scale of a huge country. And the point of that was to render the US more resilient in case of a nuclear warfare. So that's exactly what this small leaflet explained. I mean, the steel industry is very concentrated. It could be knocked out by just a few atom bombs. And that's why it is important to spread the industry across the country. And the national interstate system was part of this huge program of making the US less vulnerable to a nuclear attack. I'm going to conclude here, but really the main point that Christophe and I wanted to make in this book was that it is important to have a proper history of the Anthropocene if we want to start talking about solutions. I mean, what put us in the Anthropocene? It is a sum of choices which were made across time, where the military was important, where capitalism, of course, was important, where nationalism was important, where international competition was important. And if we don't talk about these choices, we are just treating unimportant aspect of the Anthropocene. And it is really important to go back at the root of the problems in order to talk about, I mean, seriously about what an escape from the Anthropocene could look like. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Fressoz. So we will take questions and have some questions for both of our speakers after the talks. And may I now invite Professor George Weiblen from the University of Minnesota. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jamal. And I'm honored and humbled to be a part of this panel, especially after this sweeping history situating our conversations about the Anthropocene, I think, in a very multidimensional space. It's one that I think I have come to through a personal journey, and I, as a natural scientist, as a botanist, found it quite unlikely that I'm in this position to tell you the story that I'm about to. And in contrast to Professor Fressoz's book, I am going to tell you a personal narrative, but I think you will see at a number of points how it intersects with precisely the history of the human condition and its impact on our planet that will bring us to this same point we are at, where if there's a lot we need to think about the past if we are to envision a reparative future. So let me begin by acknowledging that I am coming to you from Dakota land, Minnesota Makoche, in the Dakota language, which means the land of Minnesota or the land of sky-tinted waters. I was born and raised here, and as we will see as I share my screen with you, pardon my technical difficulties here. Are you seeing my screen, Professor Fressoz? Could you give me the thumbs up? Okay.
Yep.
So I was born and raised in Minnesota. In fact, my ancestors were German immigrants who came to Minnesota in the 1860s to farm in the Minnesota River Valley. And in fact, my great-great-uncle fought in the Dakota War of 1862. And these are photographs that I found in my attic, in my family's attic. I grew up in this place. Like most boys of my generation, I loved America, and I loved National Geographic. I read about far-off exotic places, and I was raised as an explorer, studying nature, with a strong desire to travel. It wasn't until a few years ago that I found myself circling back after traveling the world to the place where I'm from, to dig deeper into where I come from and how I've arrived at this point. I want to mention that this place where I come from has gathered attention of the world at various points through history, and perhaps most recently with the murder of George Floyd, less than a kilometer from the public school that I attended, a very intentionally desegregated public school, an experiment in breaking down the racial barriers that and socioeconomic barriers, or at least an attempt to, that was engineered by progressives in my state. It's no coincidence that the congressional district where George Floyd's murder occurred was the first district to elect a Muslim to the United States Congress. I was present in Congress when Keith Ellison was sworn in to serve, holding not the Bible, but Thomas Jefferson's copy of the Quran. Fast forward to today and the murder of George Floyd. It is no coincidence that this occurred in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the breadbasket of the world, the point through which the grain was gathered and milled and distributed. So I want to tell you how I got from Minnesota to the island of New Guinea to learn some things about our history that have brought me back home. And I was raised on the Bible, where in Ecclesiastes, it says that a generations come and go, but the earth remains forever. Well, here we are in the Anthropocene, as a human species so successful that we are harnessing most of the earth's fresh water. We are cultivating a large, almost half of the earth's arable land. We are using a tremendous amount of energy. We're so successful at feeding ourselves that the very ecological systems that have supported our success are strained to the breaking point. As a student of botany, I was attracted to the myth of going to exotic places and discovering new species. And I want to situate that in this context of seeking solutions for reparative futures, and emphasize that this has been going on for a long time, as Professor Fressoz has pointed out. In my field, botany, where we're cataloging and naming plants, this goes back to the age of European exploration. And you think about how much traditional ecological knowledge, how much indigenous knowledge passed down through generations of oral tradition was appropriated to build this economy and to develop these colonies. I just use the example of the discovery of quinine, which is still one of the most successful treatments for malaria. This was gifted from the Quechua people of what is today Venezuela to Jesuit missionaries. And that bark led to the discovery of the molecule responsible. And I wouldn't be able to share my reflections with you today if it weren't for quinine, because I've had malaria that I've contracted in New Guinea a number of times. So why New Guinea? Well, it was an exotic tropical isle famed for its cannibal history and its wildness. From a biological perspective, it's got 5% of global plant and insect diversity, but it only occupies about half the land area. So it's a big hotspot. it's a very topographically rugged place. Much of it is uninhabitable because it's either too wet or too steep. And today it's a deforestation hotspot. 25 years ago, out of college, I went there, and I came from a place that had experienced, 150 years of colonialism. I get to New Guinea, and it was one of the last places on the planet with a large indigenous population to experience colonialism. When I got there in 1992, you could still look at an aviator's map and find that the relief data from the mountains was still incomplete. Thanks to independence of the eastern half of the island, Papua New Guinea, in 1976, by virtue of its constitution, customary land rights of the people are acknowledged. And in fact, 98% of the land and the minerals beneath it and the forests on it and the water and the fish that occupy that water belongs to customary landowner groups. Very unique situation. And into that, I found myself thrown looking for new plants. And, after spending half my life commuting from Minnesota to New Guinea, I've discovered that this relationship between cultural diversity and biological diversity, this is a linguistic map of the whole island of New Guinea. And there are over 1,000 spoken languages there. It's incredible. And these languages are so different from one another. They represent waves of human migration across the Southeast Asia and the Pacific that go back at least 50,000 years. And, we think a lot as biologists about the biodiversity crisis and the extinction of biodiversity. Well, something that surprised me was some of my colleagues published a paper about 10 years ago demonstrating that the rate of linguistic extinction is 10 times higher than the estimated rate of biological species loss. And a great example are these word balloons from Europe. 90% of the 250 languages spoken in Europe are not spoken by the children today. Most of them are spoken by the parents and grandparents of those children. And a few are only spoken by the grandparents. And so we're looking at a massive loss of cultural knowledge in just one generation. So into that milieu in New Guinea, you see this incredible collision of cultures. And I like to use the example of the Bible translated into Melanesian Pidgin. This is the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Bikpela emi wasman belong me, o samino napsort logwan pela something. This is the most widely spoken language on the island today. And it's very much a product of colonialism and globalization. Technology now has reached even the most remote communities in New Guinea through distributed cellular phone services. You can now be off the grid, Facebooking with people all over the world. Some of my colleagues who are entrepreneurial have invested in solar powered refrigerators so they can sell ice cold Coca-Cola an hour's walk from the nearest source of electricity. The manager of this little store one day pulled me into his office and showed me an object and made me swear before he pulled it out that I wouldn't tell anybody about it. Well, I'm afraid that I've broken that promise by showing you this object that he said was very powerful. I said, well, where did you get it? My ancestors gave it to me. Where did it come from? God made it. And I thought, well, I've never seen a stone pounder that looks like this. Showed a photograph to it years later to an archaeologist in Canberra, Australia, and they, oh yes, there are a few hundred of those known. They date from somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 BC. Incredible that this human history and this ancient technology is still in the hands of of people today. So, I was drawn to this last frontier of rainforest discovery to experience the exchange of natural resources for cash and commodities with indigenous people, still living a subsistence lifestyle on top of incredible wealth, be it tropical timber, be it natural gas, largest gold mines, copper mines in the world today. And with no national park or no infrastructure to support me going about my research, I found myself negotiating relationships with subsistence farmers to gain access to their forest estate. And I did what every botanical explorer has done before me. I employed local people and appropriated their cultural knowledge and pinning it to the scientific nomenclature, the Linnaean system of biological classification. But I was asked many questions. I had to justify, why are you doing this? Well, there's enough interest among folks, especially leaders and elders, in this wave of globalization and the loss of cultural knowledge. And so with no formal anthropological background, I was drawn into documenting traditional names and uses of plants. This species discovery, we have to acknowledge has been and continues to be an inherently colonial enterprise in a post-colonial world. And one of the things that my students and I have started to do in this sense is acknowledge the fact that for whom the people we work with whom we work, these entities, these organisms are very well known and a part of daily life. They're only new to our botanical system. And so an example of this fig tree that lacked a scientific name, we named it Ficus rubra vestimenta in the botanical Latin, which translates as the fig of red cloth. And we chose this name because all throughout this part of New Guinea, folks boil the leaves to extract a bright red dye that is used to dye natural fibers and produce traditional grass skirts that today are really ceremonial decoration. We got grants to study the rainforest to search for new molecules. We're sitting in the middle of a pandemic, and there was a period when a lot of natural product discovery was going on, and we got a grant to isolate microbes from the leaves of trees in the rainforest that we have mapped and marked. And we stumbled upon a novel chemical that is highly effective against tuberculosis. In fact, there's currently an antibiotic-resistant epidemic in an isolated part of New Guinea happening right now. Well, I was thrilled with this discovery and brought it to the attention of our tribal elder, he said, "You got to be kidding! Like you spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and this is the best you can come up with? Every witch doctor around here knows that you can cure evil coughing with what lives in our forest." So, with those kinds of experiences, I now come back to Minnesota and want to look forward a little bit. You're looking at a satellite image. Chicago here at the southern tip of Lake Michigan. I'm coming to you from Minneapolis, St. Paul right here. And about 10 years ago, what appeared from space to be this gigantic city appeared out in western North Dakota. Well, that turns out to be the Bakken oil formation. Oil, 10, 15,000 feet under the ground, couldn't be retrieved until this new fracking technology was developed. And as soon as it was, tens of thousands of wells were drilled every year, so much natural gas pouring out that they just had to burn it all off because they couldn't build the pipelines fast enough. Well, this was 10 years ago. Now pipelines are in place. There isn't as much gas flaring, but it's a sign of the times that our technology has pushed us to this point where we really are forces of nature having heavy, lasting, and sudden impacts on our climate, on our biosphere, and on our way of life. So with that in mind, I want to step back and think, as we think about, repairing the biosphere, reparative futures. I think we have to think about this history and how we got to this point. That's incredibly important. But we can also learn from nature. As ecologists, natural scientists studying living organisms and their birth and death process, the processes through which new diversity is generated, through which it is extinguished, how materials flow through ecosystems, or how materials are cycled through systems, how energy flows through systems. There are some things we can learn. I want to come back to Minnesota and some of the things we've learned from nature here. The contributions of Minnesota to global food production have been mentioned. In fact, it was this farm kid from Minnesota who learned how to breed wheat varieties, who is credited with developing the drought-resistant wheat varieties that formed the basis for the Green Revolution and brought us to the point where we were able to feed the planet in spite of our exploding population. This was Norman Borlaug. He is quoted as saying there are no miracles in agriculture. He knew that he was creating more problems than he was solving by feeding the planet, and especially by developing forms of agriculture that took advantage of artificial inputs like anhydrous ammonia fertilizers, herbicides and pesticides, etc. So let's look at a couple of lessons that I think we can draw now that as scientists, we begin to think a little bit more humbly about the impacts of our technological developments and the need to look at our history and listen to nature. So Norman Borlaug knew that replacing diverse tall grass prairie ecosystems, with a monoculture would result in mining the soil organic matter, the very nutrition that diverse plant communities had contributed to the soil over centuries. We as ecologists had to demonstrate this by experiment. And in fact, here in Minnesota, an experimental research site not far from Minneapolis, St. Paul, is the site of the longest running biodiversity experiment of its kind, planting out different numbers of plant species into little plots and maintaining specific numbers of species in those plots year after year in a resource limited area. And we found that over time, the functioning of the ecosystem, whether you measure it by the productivity of the plant community, the amount of nutrition in the soil, the vulnerability of the community to invasive, to other species coming in, productivity, the resiliency, and basically sustainability increases with the biodiversity. And so, natural ecosystems thrive with biodiversity. Well, I think the same can be said of our cultural systems. Diverse economies, diverse societies are more resilient. And so this is a lesson from nature that is so obvious, and yet, and we should pay more attention to it. A second lesson that nobody likes to talk about, particularly Americans, is that we have to live within our limits. Benjamin Franklin said that we know the worth of water when the well runs dry. And most of us prefer restrictions on other people, not limits on ourselves. I mean, we like all the freedom and want none of the responsibility. And yet, you know, this young graduate student, ecologist, back in the 1930s, did measurements in this little closed system at the same research site, not far from Minneapolis, St. Paul. And in his short career, he created the whole field of ecosystem science. People thought this notion was pretty silly at the time, that you could take all the species within one community and frame them in terms of how energy passes from one level of that system to another, and that energy flows through that system, and how materials and nutrients are cycled through that system. This whole concept of organizing things in a food web, you know, led to the discovery of this basic rule in many ecosystems on Earth, where you know, only 10% of the energy garnered by one level in the food web is transmitted to the next level that feeds upon it or that uses it. And so, you know, when resources are limited, we need to live within our limits. It's, you know, species that can live within limits, that it's parents that can leave their offspring with more resources than they inherited from their grandparents. Those are the species that have a future, and we should learn from them. The last lessons from nature is one that is so, again, so obvious, and yet there seems to be much resistance to accepting it. Many of us like things to stay the way they are if we are comfortable, and we don't like change. Look at what the pandemic has done to social behavior in public spaces across the planet in the past year. Many of us are very uncomfortable with what the epidemiologists and what the medical profession has recommended, that we modify our social behavior to protect ourselves against this virus. And yet, you know, it's the species that can adapt to change that have a future. I look at here in Minnesota, we've got climatological data that clearly shows how our winters are shorter and warmer than they have been since we started keeping these weather records. We measure it here by the date that ice melts out on our lakes. And we do that because one of our most popular winter sports is ice fishing. Literally, tens of thousands of people gather on the ice to drill holes and fish in wintertime. Well, the ice fishing season is getting shorter and shorter. And we have to acknowledge that this is happening and adapt to it. Reversibility, I don't know. One way or the other, we're going to have to live with how things are. And, you know, I'm encouraged. I want to end my remarks with something, you know, a bit more hopeful, in the sense that, you know, life has this incredible capacity to adapt to change. It always has. And we can too. I mean, some of the earliest evidence for a living organism radically changing the atmosphere of planet Earth comes right here from Minnesota. You may not know that we have the largest iron mining region in North America, in the northern part of our state. And the reason it's there is because these blue-green algae 2 billion years ago came up with a way to harvest the sun's energy. And they produce the very oxygen that we breathe today, 2 billion years ago. They were so successful at taking in carbon dioxide and producing oxygen that oxygen is a poisonous gas. If you didn't know, you get too much of it, you will die. They were so successful at producing oxygen that these blooms of these blue-green algae would occasionally result in mass extinction. And as this happened, the chemistry of the ocean changed. And there's a lot of iron that was dissolved in the ancient seas. And when you added oxygen to that water, the iron oxidized and precipitated out into layers of iron along the sea floor that we have been mining for the past 150 years to create the steel that has built our civilization. And so, this is a 2 billion year old gift from these blue-green algae to the state of Minnesota and to the global economy. But I think it points to a lesson from nature. If these little blue-green algae could create the atmosphere we breathe today, we have some capacity to adapt to change as well. So, with these thoughts on repairing the biosphere during a global pandemic, I just leave you with these simple lessons: thriving with diversity, living within limits, and adapting to change. And I think if we can bear those things in mind as we reflect on all the other aspects of our of our humanity that need reparation, I think nature can guide us. And I really look forward to the sessions that are forthcoming in the conference. I think together they're all connected. And as someone who works in the sciences, I have to say that it's the social and human and cultural dimensions that are absolutely critical, perhaps even more important than the technology that we have as the tools to repair and envision a better future. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions from those of you watching and chatting. Thank you.
So, thank you, Professor Weiblen, and to my first speaker, Professor Fressoz as well. I was just picking up what you said, Professor Weiblen, in your concluding remarks. So the biosphere is a global ecosystem. And so I'm a computer scientist. I used to do modeling, agent-based modeling in ecosystem services. And I remember that, the kind of things that when you look at nature, one thing that we used to do back like 10 years ago was to look at nature as a commodity. And something that happened right along the line of the 1940s when the Great Acceleration, we started to observe that, right? We also had started to talk about system sciences and then systems and, biosystems and human systems and ecosystems, the biosphere as a system of systems. But what I've seen personally, and I'm sure that you may like to add to it, is that by commodifying everything within the system, we have become, and I'm picking what Professor Fressoz was saying in his talk, we become like a managers of nature, not just humbled, against nature, as you said. We like to control. So this whole idea from the 1940s about engineering and managing the land and coming up and creating markets of nature has made us even more arrogant, in my opinion. I don't know whether that's correct or not, rather than being humble. And now when we look at, from the atmosphere, the space to this planet, the planet looks like just another system that we would like to control and manage. Is that the way? And that has been, unfortunately, the way in the 1980s and the 1990s. And it's still, I think, many of my colleagues who work in the climate sciences, they like to talk about natural services, eco services, and and land management, land being a finite resource, but just another commodity. Is that the way, in your opinion, to be repairing the biosphere? So I will ask first Professor Jean-Baptiste Fressoz first, and then to Professor Weiblen to please comment on that.
Well, I'm not very competent. I will just make a small historical point. The idea that you can compensate and is actually quite old. I mean, starting from the early 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, the idea behind all the laws for regulation of pollution is that you will compensate for the damages you create. And the damages at that time, of course, they were not about species loss or biodiversity loss. They were about the loss of a landscape or the loss of crops. I mean, they were more basic loss. But the idea that you can compensate and that the polluter has to pay is very old. It's not a new invention dating from the 1970s, when suddenly the environment becomes a political issue. Actually, it has been with us for the whole history of the Industrial Revolution. And it has not really solved, of course, the environmental issues or reduced drastically pollution. It had plenty of different effects. And one of the effects that, I could study for the case of France, it was to relocate the most polluting industries in small villages far from large cities, where the pollution would cost less, basically. So, of course, all this idea of compensation has a very whole, it has a past. And when you think about biodiversity banks, or just, more basically, paying for planting trees when you take the plane, of course, they are just like environmental indulgence. What the Catholic Church would sell in the 16th century for the remission of your sins. They're not. They're not part of the solution. I think they are part of the continuation of the dynamic that we've been living in.
Yeah, I think that mentioning, carbon tax and credit is a perfect example of how an attempt to commodify and rebalance and redistribute as a way of restoring balance, repairing something that is perceived as broken, is Professor Fressoz is exactly right on this. It is like paying it. It's like paying ecological indulgences. To a religion built around the fact that we can somehow understand nature to the extent that we have the whole system. And yet folks who study systems know that these models, as all models do, fail, because they are just models. And there's complexity that is, as yet far beyond our comprehension. And yet, there may be some of these activities that are going on. They may be part of a transition. I don't know. Planting trees is better than not planting trees. It is going to take, it's going to return some carbon from the atmosphere to a living system. Okay. I'll give it that. But I think, we have to look more broadly at economy and, the talk of how we built these linear economies that always took resources and converted them into products that eventually either in their production or at end of life resulted in waste that we had to hide somewhere, or did not in some way didn't contribute to some further productivity or use. This notion of transitioning from linear economies to circular ones is interesting, and I think that's a lesson from that. If you look at the most closed ecological systems we can find, there are players in those systems that manage to pretty much return all the materials to the top of the food chain somehow. Again, and so they're these cycling systems are interesting, but I think the key point is the hubris that the natural sciences maintain is one of our biggest challenges. Our arrogance. You know, I think we all benefit from being humbled once in a while, as disciplines fight over ideas and different approaches. Argument is good, but I think there's room for humility here. And you know, in my academic world, the dominance that the natural sciences have achieved, and the diminishing, you know, the students of biology that I am involved with teaching are not exposed to this, you know, the history of science, of culture, of, you know, to a degree that trains them to be effective global citizens. It just, you know, I think we need to rebalance the way that we are educating one another.
I think because I'm a modeler, and I can't agree more than what you just said about, you know, models are useful. Of course, they are by definition wrong. But the way I think that we've been seeing the biosphere and everything around is that instead of being showing some humility, we think that because we have understood everything, which we haven't, we are able to control it. But the other thing is also that we have reduced the human and nature, the relation between them, into just functions and function types, and then you know that all right, and so the human is now reduced to some categories that we, as you know, this is a prevalent way of doing modeling of ecosystems anyway, and then of course that, you know, they are the land managers, and then how are they going to responding to some stresses and then some changes and adapting to it with very limited adaptive capacity, and so bringing back the human into this narrative, which is a problem because engineering and sciences, they like to optimize, and then of course taking out the human, and then just looking at the system from pure function point of view, you can actually come up with some very nice results, but it hasn't really worked for us. How do you bring back the human into this narrative of the idea of repairing the biosphere? So Professor Weiblen first, and then to Professor Fressoz, please.
Yes. You know, I think there's a lot of work to be done along this line. I was a fellow in this Institute on Environment, where many of the modelers and the really brilliant people who were able to pull together big data for, you know, for the first time to be able to draw together population censuses from around the world, overlay it with all these satellite and all these distributed sensors and environmental data, bringing all of that, all these layers together, and through modeling, you know, of flow inputs and outputs of flows and trade in agricultural production, trade, energy transfer, all of that, they would just, you know, they're like, it's obvious, folks in sub-Saharan Africa are not growing the right crops. We just need to tell them what to grow. And we just think of how much energy we, you know, just think of how much better off they would be, and how much better off the atmosphere would be. And as somebody who has this worm's eye view, you know, working with folks, you know, who live a subsistence lifestyle and depending on them for months at a time, and to know where they're coming from, and then to have my colleagues, you know, saying, well, if only they just do this, that's not how the world works. And you think about, how do we reclaim the humanity in this? That really gets back to decolonizing, I think. And you know, it comes back. There's a lot of there are a lot of racial and cultural issues that we have not reckoned with, as we've become so enamored of technology. And today, you know, it's digital technology in particular.
Well, I mean, I would rather talk about humility. What strikes me indeed is that when we talk about the environment, very quickly we shift to technology. I mean, that's quasi immediate. I've read Bill Gates' book, which has just been published, How to Solve the Climate Disaster. It's a pretty good book, actually. It gives you figures, I mean, the order of the magnitude that the gigatons that we've got to stop emitting and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it relies so much on technologies. And I think actually technology is quite important, but what we lack is not technology, it's time. And what the climatologists are telling us is that we have to decarbonize the economies, I mean, depending on which economy we're talking about, but by 2050 for rich countries. So, I mean, going to zero CO2 emissions by 2050, it's not going to be technologies for one very simple reason, is that the diffusion of technologies takes time. It doesn't mean that technology is not part of the story. Of course, it's part of the story, but I mean, it will never be enough. And I mean, it has been well known for quite a lot of time. I mean, in the 1970s, rich countries experienced the oil shock, and there was an outpouring of scientific reflections on how long will it take to shift to renewables already in the 1970s. And at the JASA, which was a research institute near Vienna in Luxembourg, there was an Italian scientist, an atomic scientist called Cesare Malchetti. He was very much in favor of breeders and atom reactors and so on, but at the same time, he knew very well through quantitative analysis and modeling that it would take centuries to have a global shift of the energy system. And the problem with modeling, sometimes it gives you the illusion that the global energy system is something that you can govern, which is a very, very strong hypothesis when you think about it. So, I mean, sorry, it's quite depressing, but when you take into account the time of diffusion of technologies, the fact that all technologies resist, and even like that, you simplify the problem, because of course new technologies do not replace all technologies. If I mean, to take a trivial example, you've got both vacuum cleaners and sweepers. You've got both. You still have both in your closet. But this is true for technology. It's even more true about materials, flows of materials. They do not replace one each other. They stratify on the top of the other. We have never consumed as much wood as nowadays. Even for energy uses, actually, 3 billion people are living with wood as a very important source of energy still nowadays. So we've got a discourse which is far too focused on how we're going to produce electricity with zero carbon, which is an issue, but it's probably the most simple issue in a way. So all this to say that we have to be, I mean, we really have to stop talking and being obsessed with technology and talking about what we need. And when we will seriously talk about what we really need to live a fruitful life and happy life, we'll have, I think, made a big step towards a repairing future.
So I would like to bring in Professor Nouman Naqvi over here in the discussion, but I'd like to quote from a book, a biography written on Elon Musk. There's a description from Amazon.com. It says South African-born Elon Musk is a renowned entrepreneur and innovator behind PayPal. He wants to send citizens into space to form a colony on Mars. He wants to make money while doing these things, and he wants us to know all about it. Europe for the last 2 centuries has had a huge ecological footprint, and the reason being that a lot of, as you were, both of you were talking about, especially in the first talk, that making Europe green, we actually have been excavating and mining in other places, and then really don't care about what's going on to the rest of the world, only focusing on ourselves. So what is then the future? If technology is, if the kind of obsession that we have with technology, then the next step is just going to Mars and trying to colonize it. Nouman Naqvi is here. I would like to invite him for the discussion. Please go ahead.
Thank you for that comment. Actually, while Jean-Baptiste was speaking, I was actually thinking of this crazy new project in which they actually think, they actually speak about this. They think that they can actually terraform. This is the expression that they use. Yeah, So I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson. I was a great fan of Carl Sagan. Now, of course, Neil deGrasse Tyson, as a child, I should say, I don't think that we can venture to the stars, as he used to say at the beginning of each of his episodes. But now I heard this, little program clip of Neil deGrasse Tyson, who was saying, we know how to terraform Mars, and we'll terraform Mars at some point. I mean, it's really remarkable that forget terraforming Mars. Yeah, I mean, if you asked them to turn, I don't know, the Sahara green, of course, they won't be able to do it, right? And over here, of course, they have both the advantage of the atmosphere. They have, they have the atmosphere, and they have, which you don't on Mars. And you also have gravity, the right kind of gravity, which we all, of course, who were born on this earth, have some I don't know, some relation to that gravity also. So it's remarkable, yes, and it's I mean, it's literally delusional. It's no longer in the realm of sanity, really. If you think about it, it's perfectly insane. Perfectly insane, I think, is the right expression for these ideas that are now proliferating. I mean, it's actually part of the lies that we see, the distinction between truth and lie. I really personally don't see a distinction between, this Q conspiracy and this idea that we can go and terraform Mars. I think they're equally insane and delusional. Yeah.
Naman, can I interrupt for a second? Because what you just said reminds me of the attempt back in the 1980s to do this experiment on Earth, the Biosphere experiment.
Yes.
And so we tried this once before, and so with all due respect to those who are keen on the idea, all right, test your model in the Sahara first, and then you can send the ship there, because the Biosphere, some of my mentors and colleagues worked on designing that thing, and nobody, and you know what brought it down? An ant. An ant. They had to bring soil. They tried to sterilize everything, but this little red ant that they didn't account for was in the soil. Enough of its pupae survived, or there's a queen or something, I don't know. But this little ant, proliferated inside the Biosphere and used up everything. They had to open it up, or the humans inside were going to die because of a little ant.
Yeah, just like the entire world has been upturned by a virus. Yeah, practically invisible. I mean, it's really incredible. The Anthropocene discourse. I'm really grateful to Jean-Baptiste for all these cautionary notes about the discourse of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene discourse has also contributed to this idea, in fact, that human beings have some kind of extraordinary power, when actually what's actually happening is that they're unleashing sets of processes over which they have absolutely no control, increasingly, which will be more and more out of their control. Together with that, I'd like to once again thank Jean-Baptiste for this cautionary note about the discourse of repairing the biosphere. You're absolutely right. We can't repair the biosphere. It would be completely delusional to think that one could repair the biosphere. In fact, the way this conference is organized, repairing polities, repairing economies, repairing religions and reparative ends, means we can only at best repair ourselves. And so over here as well, I think that's the message I'm taking from your remarks, Jean-Baptiste, is that that's what actually we should be focused on. There's no hope that human beings can. I mean, it's perfectly delusional to imagine that one could actually. But and what is involved in this reparation? So I find one of the gestures that George has made very interesting. Yeah, so he urges us to imitate nature. Now, the idea of imitating nature, actually mimesis, the mimesis of nature, is a very, very old idea. Yeah, I mean, and common across a number of civilizations. Yeah, in the modern period, of course, far from this mimesis of nature, what we came to think of was we could dominate nature. Yeah, I mean, it's very, very explicit in Francis Bacon. The very purpose of knowledge, actually. So, in a sense, the kind of reparation or restoration that restorative gesture or reparative gesture that's made in that remark, the plea to mimic nature, the mimesis of nature. I think that's the kind of conservatism. That's a conservative gesture, actually. I personally don't, I'm not afraid of the term conservative. I don't think we should be afraid of that term in our times, given its overlap with conservation. Yeah, surely we need to conserve things. And I think this idea of the fact that we humans need to imitate nature or the mimesis of nature, I don't know. I mean, it seems like a good suggestion to me. In terms of what we should call this period, I recently taught a class at Connecticut College. I called it Modernocene. Yeah, and I'd like to ask Jean-Baptiste about that. Right. So you did say, Jean-Baptiste, that in fact human impact on the environment goes back a very long way. Yeah, but there is. I was also reminded of the chapter on the Polemocene when you were talking about we entered the Anthropocene knowingly. So there were people who recognized quite clearly what was going on from the get-go. Yeah, both in Europe and abroad, naturally. Yeah, who understood what was being done. We hear. The voices of Native Americans, for instance, very standard discourse on the part of so many Native American chiefs who speak about this, crazy relationship to the natural environment that emerged with modern colonialism in that region. So I wanted to ask you, actually, do you think there is a qualitative difference between the past, between the human impact on nature in the past and what has happened over the past couple of 100 years? But also, what is it that's involved? So you've made this gesture, the paths not taken. Yeah, there were these paths that were not taken, which were, of course, a feature of your book also. And in other areas also, people, these lost possibilities. Yeah. What is involved in such a gesture for you? What is involved in such a gesture of gesturing towards these? If you could elaborate on that.
I mean, regarding the impact, no, I mean, there are a huge difference between contemporary impact and the way we were impacting the environment in 1800s. I mean, the masses of materials have completely changed. And interestingly enough, when you think about at one point you said that Europe was kind of parasite of the world for a long time. Actually, it's quite recent that it is the case. When you think about history, you see that the biggest powers were extractive powers in their countries. I mean, Britain was the main exporter of coal throughout the 19th and even in the beginning of the 20th century. It is exporting coal to poor countries. The US is exporting all sorts of materials, from biomass to minerals to fossil fuels, all through the 1960s, and it is starting again with shale gas anyway. So I mean, so the fact that rich countries are parasites is a kind of recent. I mean, it has become important recently only. So in a way, we are more living in an imperial world nowadays than we used to live in the mid-19th century, in a way, in the sense that, for instance, I mean, French colonies did not really matter for the French economy in the 1890 or 1900. It was not very important. but it's far more important. The Middle Eastern oil or the gas from Norway and Russia is far more important for France nowadays than Algeria was in 1830, when there were very few people actually living there anyway. I mean, both French and Algerians in a way. So that's really, I think, important not to think that we have been we have moved away. We're a post-colonial world, and so no, it's actually more complex than that. The important point of gesturing toward the path not taken, I don't know if it's really important, but I think it can give us some freedom to the technological system we live in. When you realize, for instance, the importance of the military in all the technologies we use, well, it gives you some distance with the technological world that we use, because it was built up, it was engineered, it was invented for other reasons than moving people efficiently or economically. It was engineered for being so as to be powerful, so as to kill your enemy. Planes from the 1915 to 1970, planes were more used in the army than in the civil, than for the civil economy. I mean, for a long time, planes were more used to carry bombs than to carry people. So if you take the fishing industry, it has been completely revolutionized by technologies of the Second World War, from the nylon to the sonars, the GPS, then afterwards. So, I mean, we live in a technological world which was invented for other reasons than just, you know, the common life of common people. And I think it's important to have that in mind. It can help you to just have some distance. I mean, one of the writing which I think has been important for me is some very boring books made by historian econometricians. And there is one important author who is called Vogel, who is a US economic historian. He actually got a Nobel Prize in economy for his work. And he showed with complex quantitative analysis that you could imagine the same kind of economic development for the US in the late 19th century, early 20th century without trains. Whereas train, of course, for us, seemed, I mean, as a historian of tech, seems like the inescapable providential technology which is completely transforming the economies. But when you look at that seriously, you could see that canals, well, they're very efficient for transporting goods. Okay, so I mean, that I think history is important so as to be more, you know, cautious about the dictum or the diktat, sorry, of technological gurus. I think that it is useful for that, for instance. And when you were talking about Elon Musk, I mean, what strikes me is that this character, which is described as having like the future in his bone, but all his dreams are so old-fashioned when you think about it. I mean, colonizing Mars, flying cars, intelligent robots, all this is very old-fashioned sci-fi from the 1950s. So, I mean, and of course, the main point of explaining that he's going to put settlers on Mars is just to occupy the public arena, which is important, I guess, for the value of the share of Tesla. And the danger of that is that it gives the impression there is another way. There is a plan B, which relies on technology, geoengineering, and all this stuff. And this is dangerous. I mean, in my Google news, how do you call that? The fact that Google sends me news from all over the world, because I'm interested in the history of energy. Every day, I receive 2 or 3 articles on the fact that nuclear fusion is really, we're very close. We are very close to nuclear fusion because there is some obscure startup in the US who has succeeded in producing for a few milliseconds a nuclear fusion reaction. This is part of a whole narrative of, you know, we can do something else than just trying to restrain our consumptions and so on and so forth. So I mean, that's why I think the history of tech and the alternative futures could be interesting.
We are now towards the end of the panel, but I have one last question for Professor Weiblen and to his comment about there is no plan B. So without, and one thing that I've seen, Professor Weiblen, is that we scientists, we live in our own sphere, in our own system, and then, you know, people think, most of the people think that what we are doing is something we are always on the right path and we are doing things correctly. We are able to tackle complexity, which we are unable to do so anyway. So bringing the discourse that are happening within the academia to the general public, I think that is important. But the idea that you just mentioned in your comment about there is no planet B, I think that will be a concluding remark from you. That can be nice to close this session as well. So please, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, I read the science fiction and I'm still reading it, and I love it. And I think there's something about being human that we want to imagine these possibilities, and it's all right to have those dreams. But for me to see technology, to see global capital, investment capital pushed, these fantasies pushed into the realm of venture monetized in this way, to see these dreams monetized like this is really, it's really a sad exploitation of our very human tendency to want to imagine these possibilities. And I would just caution anyone about putting their resources behind those kinds of dreams, or using that as some kind of excuse for accepting the status quo, that we will find, we'll find our way out of this predicament, and instead keep those fantasies in the form of literature. They do say the truth is stranger than fiction. It's a cliche. But I think the technology has brought us, the technology is driving us to believe in possibilities that could be achieved, that can never be achieved, and it would be so much more, it would be so much simpler, it would be more conservative to look at our deep history and how we have learned from our failures, and we've been opportunistic. And some of the things that we have learned, through inquiry, the knowledge that we've gathered, a lot of it came about through failed experiments, through misguided efforts. And yet that element of chance, something was learned. That I think is important to bear in mind, that there is no salvation in science. And with that, I think I've said enough.
Thank you. And I like to thank both of our panelists, Professor Jean-Baptiste Fressoz, Professor George Weiblen, my colleague, Professor Nouman Naqvi. And I don't know how to summarize these two wonderful talks, but I think there is no reparation for the biosphere without taking into account religion and faith and people's culture and history and economies and polities. All of these things that we think are just another domain, and the scientists, they work in one domain. I don't think that is the way to go. If you have any chance of repairing the biosphere, then we have to take into account all of these things that matter to us. Tomorrow's session is about repairing polities, and we're all looking forward to that. With that, thanks once again.
Now, allow me to also thank the panelists.
So
thank you, Jean-Baptiste. Wonderful, stimulating talks. Thank you.
Well, thank you for invitation and questions and remarks. Thank you for the discussion.
And
likewise, it's been a pleasure.
So we have 3 time zones at the moment, I think. So it's a good night or good afternoon or good evening to all of you who are here. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you again. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Good afternoon.
Bye.